started with who's here now, and then I'm sure there might be a few people that join along the way.
I think that sounds good, Stephen.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is great. Looks like we have a lot of folks here. Just so we can get a sense, I'm sure you all are familiar now where everybody's become Zoom experts, but you have down in the bottom right, hopefully the reactions. So if you can hear me okay, just give a thumbs up so we can kind of see that folks can hear. All right, looks like we're good. The people that can't hear are going, why are all these thumbs up happening? So we just, again, we really appreciate you being here. We're excited to, kick off our TCOM cloud gathering. So we're very thankful and grateful that we're able to continue to meet as a large TCOM community. I'll introduce myself and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves. So I'm Stephen Shimschock. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Innovation in Population Health at the University of Kentucky. I'm also an assistant professor of biostatistics there, and looking forward to talk about the visualization garden. And I'll let Madelyn and Kate introduce themselves. Madelyn?
Hi, I'm Madelyn McDonald. I am a policy analyst with the Center for Innovation in Population Health at the University of Kentucky, and I also do work as the program manager for the Precision Analytics team. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks. And I'm Kate Cordell. I am an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky, consulting to help out Stephen and Madelyn. I'm also a managing director of Mental Health Data Alliance, where I perform consulting mostly in California. And then I'm the co-founder of OPICA, a new endeavor. Thank you.
All right, so Madelyn's going to kick us off, but I do just want to quickly acknowledge Barbara Dunn, who's here. Can you wave, Barbara? A lot of this conference wouldn't be happening right now without Barbara, so we appreciate all the efforts you've put into making this a possibility. All right, Madelyn, you want to get us kicked off?
Absolutely. Do you want to share your slides?
Oh, yep, here we go. Sorry, I thought I was sharing, but you're right.
You're fine.
Okay. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen.
Mm-hmm. All right, are we ready?
Yep.
Well, thank you all for choosing to join our session when there's so many wonderful ones to choose from. It's exciting to be one of the groups kicking off the first day of the conference, first official day. So today we're here to debut our TCOM Data Visualization Garden, which is a project that's been in the works for a great amount of time. And we're finally having the opportunity to put the work into it and begin to make it what we hope it will become, which is a really wonderful resource for data visualizations related to TCOM work. So first, we've already done introductions. We'll go over an overview of the visualization garden and what it is. We'll go through the process of developing a visualization, walk through a prepared example, and walk through the process altogether. And then we'll discuss next steps, wrap up, and address any questions. So we'll have a chance for questions at the end, but feel free to put them in the chat throughout, and we'll get to them if we have a chance. Thank you.
And I'll advance the slide here, Madelyn, but I just wanted to highlight and make sure that our hope today is that you walk away with a framework or sort of a way of being able to develop visualizations and think about them. We'll be kicking off the visualization garden shortly after the conference. And so we'll talk a little bit more about where you'll find it and all that good stuff a little bit later.
All right, so what is the visualization garden? Our vision for it is to create a curated and public source for visualizations related to TCOM tools, including the CANS, FAST, and ANSA. It will be populated with both TCOM team submitted material and user submitted material. So we're excited to provide some of our own visualizations to get it started, but we're really inviting participation from the wider TCOM community. A big part of what's going to make this a wonderful resource, we hope, is having that participation and seeing how other people are using this data as well. The audience primarily will be the larger TCOM community, like I said. We hope that people will peruse the garden for inspiration. We hope that people can contribute by submitting their visualizations. And we ideally hope it'll serve as a menu of options to show the different kinds of things that can be done with this data. So it will be housed on the TCOM Conversations blog. And again, we'll give you more information about how to get there, how to get involved. But that's where you'll be able to find it ultimately. And we'll keep the conversation on there. So we have 2 aspirational goals. Goal 1 is that we are always growing. There's a community of folks who can share great ideas about newly discovered ways that this data can inform person-centered care. We expect this approach to mature and grow and continue opening up opportunities for TCOM to help inform this care and find new ways of providing it. Second goal is we hope to share our harvest. Once an approach has proven fruitful, we hope to share that with the wider community. An example being if we find a particular visualization is helpful for identifying racial or ethnic bias in care, we hope to share that so other people can use that kind of visualization in their work. And we hope to share these success stories so that others can use them to harvest similar fruit. All right. And Stephen, do you want to take it from here or shall I continue with this one? You're muted.
Yeah, I think keep going, Madelyn.
Okay, so the process to contribute ideas to the garden, we want to review existing visualizations to identify favorite is in the garden already. We'll complete the visualization submission form and then submit that form. Did we want to go through that form now or later?
I think we can go through it at the towards the end once we've kind of walked.
That's what I was thinking as well. Wanted to double check. All right.
All right.
Great.
I'm trying to click unmute and click slide advance at the same time. So, all right, Kate.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so you know, I'm sure most people are familiar with the TCOM tools, but there's always a few new folks in the audience. So just for those new folks, really one of the benefits of the TCOM tools, the CANS, the ANSA, the FAST, and the other tools, is that they support person-centered care. It's a little different than a traditional psychometric tool. And so this requires a different approach to the way that we handle the data and how we can visualize it. The great aspect about that is that there's so much flexibility in what we can do with the data. The difficult aspect of that is there's so much flexibility in what we can do with the data. And so this is really the challenge that the visualization garden addresses, is that there's so many opportunities with the TCOM tool. We really needed to come up with a rubric on how to share those opportunities, because these tools can be used to not only identify people's stories, but track trends in populations, plan for care through algorithms. There's so many ways that these tools can potentially inform care. So here's the rubric that we came up with to take our first kind of stab at creating this community where we can share ways that we've used the tool to help identify how to inform care. So the first part of the rubric is really to identify what question you're trying to answer. And I think we talked about this perhaps even last year at TCOM. We're really creating this question library. And if all you have at this time are questions, that's a good place to start. So we don't discourage anyone from contributing. If all you have is a question saying, I really wish I could use the tools to answer this question, I'm not sure how, then let's put our minds together, right? And we'll walk through this rubric through today's presentation so we can show you some examples of, okay, I have this question. Let's think about, what's the context and so forth, working through that question. We'll go through a couple examples. And then, so what the next thing is, once you have the question, you really need to think about what is the context for that question. Is that question trying to help a family understand their cans? Is the question, how can I communicate strengths to a child? That's a much different audience than if your question is, how do I identify if people are improving in care? One is informing a system, the other is informing a child or family. And so you're gonna present the data in a much different way, depending on who you're presenting it to. If you're presenting it to staff, who are the staff that are working with the families, they need a much different set of information than administrators or families. So you really gotta consider your audience, your phase. So we'll go through all of these different contexts, but in just a moment. But in addition to audience, it's the phase, the utility, the unit, and the measurement type. So there's these different aspects of the context that we'll walk through. And then the next part of the rubric is, how do I prepare my data? So now that I know my question, I know my audience and phase, utility, unit, and measurement type, what are the next steps? I really need to break that down into, are we just looking at 2s and 3s? Are we looking at all the scores? Are we looking at just needs? Are we looking at strengths? How do we handle the different types of items? What about the trauma items? Are those included? Are those excluded? What about the modules? So we really need to kind of walk through what's included, how to prepare the data to answer that question. And then another helpful aspect is to really see the visualization, even in mock-up form. A lot of times when I create a new visualization, I'll actually just sketch it out on a piece of paper first, or even in Excel, I'll mock it up. I'm getting really talented at creating fake visualizations so that I can then take the data and walk through every step it takes to get it into my vision in that example. And then what are the formatting considerations? So, if you're looking at change over time and you're looking at 4 points, that's a lot different than looking at 20 points. And will 20 points fit on a page and a screen? And if we want to automate that, or how many colors, if you're looking at a group of kids in one graph, looking at more than 10 kids in a graph or 10 adults in a graph is going to just be too much information. So there's always some formatting considerations, that need to be addressed or added to that example. And then finally, the most important thing is, why are we even creating this example? What's the action that we expect? If we're creating a strength report for children to understand their strengths, what action do we want for them to take or for us to take with them? Really what we're hoping to do is inspire the child to recognize their strengths and perhaps build towards some additional strengths. And so that's the action there. But every visualization should be tied to some sort of action that it would take. And you can advance the slides. Thanks, Stephen. Okay, so then this is just a visualization of the context. So obviously the question is pretty straightforward. We're going to ask a question, and then we're going to think about the context, which of course is the audience, which I described, the phase, the utility. Utility meaning, is it describe, evaluate, formulate, and Steve will cover that. The unit, individual, subgroup, or whole group, and then the measurement type, and we'll cover the difference between a process and a project measure. Thank you. Okay, so the audience I covered briefly, but here to go in a little bit more depth, who could really benefit from receiving this information? It's so important to consider your audience. Are we providing this for a youth or family, a practitioner clinician? Is this a multidisciplinary team? We may need to have a couple different visualizations of the same information for different audiences. And so it's really good to remember and write down first, who is the audience of this visualization? Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Oop, you jumped ahead there. There you go.
I was trying to use the spacebar trick to unmute myself, but it advanced the slides, so that was not helpful. All right. So the key decision points, hopefully this looks very familiar to folks, but this is definitely something you want to consider on 2 different levels when you're thinking about a visualization. So one, what is the visualization about? So is it about a particular one of these key decision points? And then 2, what decision are you trying to make with the information? So if you have a visualization, how is it going to impact, what is it going to impact? Is it, you know, I'll cover as an example, the average impact report, which many of you are familiar with, or the average impact visualization. That's really like a programmatic level of need reduction over time. But if you think about something as simple as a visualization of a newly completed cans, especially like at initial, that's what you're going to use as your way to sort of look at whether or not somebody qualifies for a program. So that would be that access piece. If you're looking at two different cans to compare the initial to some, you know, recent version, you might be doing that as a way to look at whether or not the interventions you put in place were effective. So you would be, you know, gearing that visualization towards intervention effectiveness. So this is just a way that you can begin thinking about what decision point am I trying to influence? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do with data and information, is help make data informed decisions. A phrase much easier said than actually carried out in real life. So this should look familiar, and it's just a way to kind of help us think through specifically what it is that we're asking about, or what decision we're trying to influence. This is just a matrix we created to help both with the utility, what is the report aiming to do, and at what unit level are we talking about. So we came up with a simple way to just think through, is this descriptive? So meaning it's providing information that describes something. So a printout, for example, of a completed cans for an individual would be a descriptive visual, you know, it's not even a visualization, it would just be a printout at that point, but it's about an individual. Or if you had a simple sum of all the actionable items and all of the usable strengths for one youth, that's a descriptive report. It's just giving you a count of how many or what percent. If you are looking at, you know, the top 10 actionable items at initial for kids over 15, that's a subgroup level, it's still descriptive. Or if you want to look at what are the top 10 actionable items at initial for all of the youth in our program, that would be kind of a whole group. The other thing too, we tried to keep these, you'll notice it doesn't say like individual youth or family. We try to keep it generic enough too, so that you can think of an individual as a clinician. So if I want to look at what are the total number of clients that a clinician has right now, that's an individual clinician level report telling me how many clients they currently have. So you can think of it as a subgroup, maybe clinicians under a particular supervisor, or all the clinicians in your whole group. Evaluate, so when you look at a visualization that's evaluative, it's comparing something. So if I'm looking at total actionable items at initial and at some recent assessment, now I'm comparing these two time points and I'm looking at what's that difference, what has changed. I may want to look at, you know, what are those top 10 items at initial, and what do they look like 2 assessments later for, you know, kids over 15 or kids under 15. So anytime you're comparing, that's really an evaluative, visualization. And then when you think about a more mature implementation of TCOM, you may get to a place where you can actually formulate or provide insight based on past data. So if I look at a particular profile of youth and I do a brand new assessment on a youth, I can use that past performance of youth, like the person right in front of me, that may give me some insight into how they're going to interact in our program. I might see, well, this type of kid that I just did an initial cans on actually fares really well in our program, or no, this kind of kid, typically we struggle to move these particular items, and I may want to focus there. So that's really like when you're using more advanced analytics, like machine learning, predictive analytics, those kinds of things, to provide you some prospective idea of how a youth may, or a group of youth may, move through your program. So the utility is really, is it a report describing something, evaluating something, or formulating? And the units are that individual, subgroup, whole group. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'll turn it back over to Kate.
I'm on mute. So the next thing to consider is whether or not the measurement type is a process or a product measure. So a process measure is really looking at, did we do what we said we'd do? You know, it's more of a fidelity measurement, whereas a product measure is more looking at what was the result of what we did. So did we assess when we plan to assess every 6 months, perhaps? How many assessments, for example, how many assessments were completed on time? So if we did a plan to do every 6 months, how many of those were actually captured every 6 months? Because really, when we do our analysis, all we have is the data we have. We don't obviously have the data we didn't collect, and we also can't shift the time and make the data we did collect on time. So we're going to have certain numbers or certain quality of data where we really need to identify what's the quality of our data, and that would be a process measure. Did we do what we said we'd do? And then the product side, for example, would be, okay, so we assessed on time in this case, and then how many from those assessments were in each level of care. So we use that assessment data and we identified level of care. And so then the result of that is how many are in each level. So that's the difference between a process and a product. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that it was super helpful to think about items in a particular way. And so the cans, the ands, and the fast have different questions that may relate to needs or strengths. It's, certainly in the name of the tools. And so when we think about needs, these are things that can improve, that we can address. And we think about strengths, we think about these are things that can build or they can be present. But there's also a number of items on the tools that don't change. And so it's really important to consider those different items in different ways. There are more underlying needs in general. And this is, of course, the traumatic events. And then there are some versions of the tools that will ask about past behaviors and in an ever way. Did you ever have this happened? Have this happen? Were you ever arrested? Were you ever, did you ever have substance use issues? And so when we talk about past behaviors that are long ago, we can't change those either. So these types of questions should not be included in any of our outcomes where we're looking for change. So it's really important that before you go through and create a visualization, you are identifying and flagging and tagging these items according to what type they are. And of course, now you have caregiver needs and caregiver strengths and resources in the cans. And those are important to separate because not every child has a caregiver and some children have more than one caregiver. And so we need to handle those in different ways. And often the way that I handle caregiver items is they really do have to be separate, because if you're looking at everything and you're including the caregiver items, those kids that maybe don't have a caregiver identified at the moment are going to seemingly have fewer needs if you're just adding them all up, but in reality, they probably have more. And so we really need to think about caregiver needs and strengths separately in its own little bucket. And so it's really important to really go through your assessment tool and flag each one. Is this a strength? Is this a need? Is this an underlying need or an underlying item? Is this a caregiver need or caregiver? Or if we're talking about the ANZA or non-CANs, it could be a support need, right? Our natural support, our support in our family circle. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kate. So I'm going to walk through an example. Our hope is to provide an example of something that you all should be somewhat familiar with. The average impact visualization, when you see it, should be familiar. Kate will then walk through a couple more examples, and then what we want to do as a group activity is work through one together. So we'll be soliciting ideas of something that we could walk through together. So be thinking if you have a question that you kind of you've been, like, oh man, I'd love to answer this question, but haven't kind of figured out how to walk through it. We're going to be soliciting for some ideas here in a little bit. But I want to walk through the average impact. So we're going to just go through these 6 steps that Kate just talked about so that we can look at something that's familiar and walk through each of these steps. So let me actually, I have the example down here. I'll back up. So let's just start here. We'll start with, most of you have seen this. You may not have seen this with the ever in the middle. You probably have just seen the initial and some point in time in, what we're calling last. So, or it could be exit or discharge, however you think of that when somebody's leaving a program. So this is an aggregated level report that's looking at the average number of actionable items at initial. And I'll describe ever, well, I can describe it now, but ever is basically, let's say this is the challenge when you have, perhaps you're looking at a cohort where some kids may have only had 3 assessments, some kids had 5, some kids had 4. So one way that you can account for the differing numbers of assessments that kids have is you can say, well, let's look across all of their assessments, including their initial and including their last one. What was the max need they had for any particular item? So if they had a 3 on depression at some point, then that 3 would get logged in their ever kind of time frame, which is really an aggregated time frame of the whole time they were with you. So it's the max amount of need that ever happened within your program. So you can see at initial, the average number of items was 10.1. When we look at the max need ever within this program, on average, kids had 13.1 actionable items. And then when we look at last, it was down to 8.6. So ever is very helpful in giving you a better sense of true need reduction. If you only have the initial and last, you would see that you're missing a significant amount of need reduction that actually occurred. And it doesn't mean that kids got worse in the program, which is why you see that spike in ever, but it just simply means you likely got more information about them. Fun little fact that we see across data sets, places that have a very short time frame for an initial assessment, like 30 days, you have to complete your assessment within the first 30 days. And they're very highly compliant with that, tend to see a big jump between initial and ever. Places that have a longer time frame or lighter caseloads where they can spend more time on that initial assessment, see less of a jump between initial and ever. So it's just one of those balancing acts of how do I perform a very comprehensive initial assessment, but still find ways to keep it within a reasonable timeline. But just an interesting little thing we see on data sets across the board. So this is the visualization that we're going to talk about. So now we'll back up and walk through these 6 questions. So the average impact visualization, it's providing you an overall picture of need reduction over time. So the question that we're looking to answer is, what's the difference between the average number of actionable items at initial compared to ever, and ever compared to last? So we may want to look at that total need reduction, that ever to last, as just getting a general sense of, for our program, what does that look like? And then obviously you would be able to, if you wanted to, kind of slice that by particular groups of youth, over 15, under 15, males versus females, whatever, like level of care 2 versus level of care 3, or whatever your levels of care may be. So as we move to the next piece, when we look at context, so the audience, this generally appeals to those seeking, it's really a blunt, high-level measure of system performance. Average impact gets used a lot to measure up or to manage up. So if you're, just trying to communicate to folks at an administrative level or even out to your community, just giving a general sense of how need reduction happens over time. It's pretty easy to explain and understand, so it works well in that way. The phase, so again, this is when I was talking about those phases. When we think about the key decision points, because it's longitudinal in nature, it's about kids that either have had multiple reassessments and or maybe have left your program, right? It could be about kids that left your program as well. And we'll talk about how you would define those parameters in a minute. So even though you would need kids to have been through those, at least 2 assessments in order to calculate ever, in terms of its impact though, on where would you be making decisions using this particular visualization, it really is about your whole system. So it could impact any one of the decision points when you think about it, because it's really more of a programmatic level assessment. In terms of utility, this is an evaluative because we're comparing these different time points, right? We're comparing initial to ever and ever to last. So it's evaluative in that nature. The unit is typically at a subgroup or a whole group level. In the example I was giving, that would be an example of a whole group, but it could also be, an example of a subgroup. Or like I said, you might be comparing that chart for two different subgroups. That's a very useful way to use that. We do that a lot, where we'll look at, either level, like I said, level of care, or even just defining some characteristics. So you might decide, I want to look at kids that have adjustment to trauma compared to those that don't have adjustment to trauma at initial. That's an interesting one to look at. So you can use it side by side to compare two different groups. And from a measurement type standpoint, this is a product measurement. So it's really summarizing the change that occurred over time. If you think about it, it really is the result of your program's process. So it really is kind of a great way to sort of have a high level overview of how your program is functioning overall.
Hey, Stephen.
Yep.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Do we want to hold them for a little later or get into them right here?
How many are there?
It looks like a couple from Barbara and one from Daniel.
Okay, let's just go ahead. If there's a few of them, let's go ahead and do it now.
Yeah, so from Daniel Estabrook, for this is a minute ago, on the actionable needs, why include actionable needs versus person needs, since increasing strengths could make it look like kids got worse?
Let me make sure I understand that. Can you read that one?
It was,
yeah, he can clarify too. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, it was actually about, can you go back to that visualization?
Oh, yep. Okay, there you go.
And maybe it was it got cut off. It says average actionable, but it doesn't say needs. And so I just wanted to clarify, are we talking about the person needs that can improve, or are we including strengths in here? Are we also including underlying needs? What do we mean when we say actionable on this visualization?
Awesome. And so I think different people will possibly use it in different ways, but you're bringing up a good point about having, if I were putting this in a report, I would have some text down below that would describe the inclusion criteria that we're using, that would describe what needs are being included. It would describe whether or not we're including strengths. We do sometimes include strengths on this, because if you think about it, a strength that is a 2 or a 3 that needs to be developed is considered, actionable. And so you would want to track that gain if you developed a strength as an improvement. But some people will do those separately. So they'll do one for needs and then look at one for strengths. The challenge with just looking at strengths is then the numbers can get really small. But that's a great question. And so typically I would not include things like what Kate was talking about, background needs. I wouldn't want to include trauma in here because you wouldn't anticipate seeing that change over time. So I just want to look at needs that I would see are changeable. There is sometimes, like in substance abuse modules, there will be a question about history of use. Like I wouldn't include that because again, that's not something that we're likely to see change. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
And this is
Right.
Barbara. I think that answered one of my questions as well. And I think one of the really great parts about having this data visualization garden is also the standardization of language. So an average impact report, an average actionable impact report. I mean, how we start developing the language then gives us a way of saying, oh, I know what this is, but I do agree that it's good to have that kind of verbiage at the bottom to describe what it is as we're all getting used to these terms. And in terms of the setting needs that don't change, that's a really good call out because we've seen where there's certain needs that don't change. And so when you sort of put them in the mix, what we see is they sort of boost up the actionable, which in some ways helps to explain what's going on, how complex the situation is, but still those that are actionable and those come down. So I appreciate having the complexity in there. So at some point, maybe we could speak to how that works depending on who the audience is.
Yeah, I just recently was that issue, a similar issue to that just came up. So there's 2 different groups we found in one jurisdiction. There's youth that have some externalizing behaviors that appear to be driven more from developmental intellectual issues. And then there was another group that had underlying or externalizing behaviors, but also had a lot of untreated trauma. Now, there's a lot more trauma items in this particular version of the cans that we were looking at compared to developmental intellectual items. So if you included those, it would look like the trauma kids had a lot more actionable items. But given that their trauma is not going anywhere, you would see less, it would appear you would have less need reduction. And that just wasn't, that's actually the question that had come up, is they were saying, why do these kids have less need reduction? But when we really looked only at those needs that could change over time, they were very, very similar. They were doing a good job actually with both groups in terms of reducing need. But yeah, so those are super, super important questions and things to consider as you're moving through building a visualization. So thank you for those. And I know we have like 68 people on here, but I think in terms of questions, I'm pretty comfortable if we just go ahead. If you have them, let's just ask them. So either put them into the chat or go ahead and take yourself off mute. If it gets unwieldy, we'll figure out a little more moderated way to do it. But for now, I would say, yeah, let's just go ahead and ask. All right, so this is kind of where we're talking about in terms of preparation of data. We probably will want to include more information than just what you see on the screen here, but I wanted to give a flavor of how you would approach this particular portion. So when we go back and look at these 6 questions here, or these 6 sort of steps that we're looking at, we're at step 3, preparation of the data. So when we're looking at preparation of the data, we need to answer questions like, well, who's included in this? So for this one that you're looking at, this was an example of youth that had an initial assessment between January 1 and June 30th. It's fake data, so I'm just making up dates, but just to give context, like how you might phrase this. In addition, only youth with 2 or more assessments were included. So if somebody didn't have a secondary assessment, they were not included. That's a really, really important thing I like to note as well, because it's not uncommon when I'm doing that average impact for someone, I will provide them with, here are kids that do not get a second assessment. In some instances, that can be a significant number of kids. Even let's say it's 30–40%, which would be pretty high. You would want to look at the need profiles of those youth, because your hypothesis would be, maybe these are youth that just didn't have a lot of need, didn't qualify for the program. If that's the case, then that's pretty good. That's news for you, or at least not upsetting news. But if you see that those kids have needs at a similar level to the kids that continued in your program, that means that the mechanism for them not coming back is something systematic or programmatic. It could be that they don't understand what the next steps are, or they may feel what you have to offer doesn't meet what their needs are. So that could be a real engagement issue that you're looking at. So it's really important to do either, you can do something like, chi-square or other kinds of tests to look at, is the population that's not getting reassessed, different substantially in some way than the kids who continue in the program. I worked with a place recently where we saw some of that. And we were a little bit concerned because some youth that were not being reassessed were high needs kids, but we had come to learn that residential, they have a lot of out-of-state residential, and those kids were not being reassessed, but they were still in care. So you can begin to discover important things about how your population is experiencing your program. And obviously, if you have a high needs youth that's not coming back, we really want to understand why is that. So those are the ones that we would really want to take a good look at. So only changeable needs and strengths were used. So in this instance, I did use behavior, life functioning, the risk domain, the culture domain, the caregiver, and the strengths domain. And the caregiver items were filtered to only those items that we determined were buildable or changeable. But again, so this would just be a place where you could, identify how you want to look at that. And I'm going to just pause for a moment right here to also say, two things. So one, in full transparency, our hope was to have the visualization garden up and running by this point. As you all may know, we made a move from Chapin Hall to the University of Kentucky, and building a new data center in a new location takes a lot of work and dedication. And so we really had to put this on hold a little bit while we built our data center back up. So, but one of the things we were struggling with when we talked about, well, let's put the visualization garden out there and let's kind of repackage the TCOM suite of reports on the visualization garden, is that we found it to be too restrictive. So we don't want to say the average impact should only be limited to behavior, life functioning risk. Rather what we'd like to say is, when you're preparing this report, note what you're including, because what we found is in different jurisdictions, they want to include different things. And so what we don't want to be in is a position where we're prescribing, no, it has to be this way, otherwise it's not considered the average impact. So what we're really trying to do is create ways in which we can have lots of flexibility with visualizations, but be really clear about what's included and how we're including kids and how we're including items and domains. So hopefully that makes sense for folks. Okay, and so here I'm defining initial. So add up all the actionable items in the domain, and then divide that by the number of youth in the cohorts. So again, that would be the number of youth included in the cohort. I know some folks will run that average impact and sometimes have a different denominator in the initial, because they'll use all the kids that had an initial assessment. And then for the last, they only use those kids that had multiple assessments. I kind of prefer to know that when I'm looking at the chart, it's all the same kids. So my preference, again, people can, as long as you're noting it, I think you're okay. But my preference is always to have the same denominator across all three of those points, the initial, the ever, and the last. Because then I know now that I'm really looking at the same group of youth and how our program is impacting them. So again, ever, very helpful tool, especially when, like I said, you might have youth that have 3 assessments, some that have 5, some that have 8. And so ever is just simply taking the max score for each item across all assessments, including the initial and the last. And then you're basically, it's an aggregated total actionable or total need and strengths to be built across all time for a person. And then last is simply all the actionable items that you're including on that last assessment divided by the number of youth in that cohort. So that's kind of how those calculations are being pulled together. And then that's what gives you the report here. And so, yeah, typically I would have some inclusion criteria notes, and then I would have notes on the items that are included as well in presenting it. So just quickly, some interpretation notes. So just things to think about. So that, you know, this provides an overall sense of need reduction over time. You know, people always ask, why is the ever number higher than initial? Are kids getting worse in our program? We know that's not always true. You know, you can investigate that, obviously, if you feel like you need to investigate it. But typically what it's representing is you're getting to know that youth better over time. And so there are needs that you might not have seen at initial that you did discover some point later. There's also trajectories. Kate and I have had several conversations about this where, you know, when you are finally addressing untreated trauma, it is not uncommon for kids to struggle with incorporating the emotions that come with that. And so seeing anger when you didn't see anger before at initial is actually like a road mark, a good one, right? It's a good trajectory in terms of you're starting to uncover these emotions, and then what you ultimately want to see is them, you know, finding ways to deal with that in a more constructive manner. So there's certain times where you might see needs emerge, and that's a good thing. So a large increase between initial and ever could indicate a need for more thorough initial assessment. That's, you know, might be something you take away from that. The difference between ever and last can be viewed as your program's kind of overall effectiveness at reducing need. And then, like I said, you can do different kinds of slicing.
Yes, Stephen?
Yep.
We've got a question in the chat. Is the data visualization garden going to focus on the CANS 2.0 Core 50 and comprehensive?
So really it will be, like I said, we're kind of like CANS version agnostic, right? We're trying to create a way that we can articulate how we're putting together a a visualization. And so actually, you know, that's another good note. I don't know that we thought about that, but it would be good to note what version of the cans you're using that's underneath a particular visualization. But yeah, this would really apply to any version of the cans and Fast, any of the tools. If I misinterpreted the question, feel free to either.
No, this is Barbara. That was exactly, you know, part of the question is, you know, we've always struggled with standardization and, you know, how do you look at populations when you've got different cans versions that are being used. So I didn't know how much the data visualization garden also was going to benefit those who are using a standard version of the cans to be able to say, well, this is a particular population. We have a similar population. What do we expect as we're starting to build this? So that we can, you know, help each other out in that way.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So yeah, I would say that we're really trying to be more, as you were describing that, Barbara, it struck me, I was thinking, so if we created, you know, John's term mass customization is very applicable here, right? Because if we created a standard way of building the report, which is kind of what the standard suite of reports does right now, it will be a hit for some and a miss for others. So if rather what we do is standardize the report itself or the visualization itself, but we standardize the way in which we're formulating how we're coming to that visualization, and standardizing the way we're articulating who's included, what's included, I think that gets us to a place where we can have some structure in the way we communicate, but also have customization for a particular program's, you know, whatever version they're using or what tool they're using. These are all great points, and you all are like validating the struggles we've been going through. It like, we can't do this alone. We have to do this as a community. So we've really been trying to figure out a platform that we can use to engage a larger community in articulating how we go about doing visualizations.
Well, I'm just going to throw something else in there, and I don't know if you'll be able to address it at some point or if it's an after this sort of discussion. You know, there are states that have multiple versions of the cans that sort of build on each other, and then how those would sort of add together for an initial, an ever, and a last. So if they start with the cat and then they have the core and then they do the comprehensive, but the idea is that it keeps on building on each other. Do you pull it forward, you know, those different pieces?
Yeah, those would be excellent considerations as well.
And
I know, oh, go ahead, Kate, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, just to take a little bit a different perspective or way to think about the different TCOM tools is what you're doing is you're capturing parts of a person's story that are important to the work that you're trying to do or partner with that person on in terms of their well-being or their safety. And so in a different area of that system of care, whether that be an adult system of care or a children's system of care, you're going to focus on a different area. And when you think about well-being is this huge universe that could include so many different questions of a person's story. We don't have time to ask them all. And so we want to ask the questions that are important to the work that we're doing with that person or that family. And so having a different version is a good thing, because if we were to say everybody has to use these same questions, then we wouldn't allow schools to focus, you know, on the areas that they could focus on a system of care, or substance use focus on areas they really want to dive into substance of care. I mean, in a system of care with adults or children. And so, I mean, I really think about the cans as capturing the part of the story that we're really focusing on, in addition to the contextual parts of the story that we need to consider so that we can help that person transform their story. And so I think having different versions of these tools are so helpful. And really what we need to do is identify a definition of success for the area that we're focusing on with the child, the adult, or the family, but then sit that under a larger umbrella of a definition of success for that person's whole well-being. So if we can begin to consider these tools as being parts of a person's story, then really these whole different versions, it kind of just fades away. You're thinking, this is the part of the story I'm focusing on, right? And that's the part of the story they're focusing on. Together, it makes a more complete picture.
Well said. Well said. All right, well, I'm going to just wrap up real quickly on this one, just talking about some formatting considerations. It's helpful, obviously, to see different colors, but you would also want to know, like, if you're, some places when they print, it prints out in black and white, so you'd want to be aware of that. It's helpful, I think, to display the numbers the bars represent. Like I said, in terms of taking action, you can use it as a conversation starter about differences that you're seeing between initial, ever, and last. A question I often ask anytime I'm using any visualization and I'm presenting it back to especially those who work directly with clients is, does this match your lived experience of your clients? So that's when people talk about data quality, and sometimes they'll say, well, we're not sure about our data quality, so we don't want to do any reporting just yet. I'm like, there's no better time to do reporting. So put lots of that data and give it back to folks and ask them, does this match your lived experience? It's not uncommon to have folks go, well, I didn't know you were going to report on that. I would have filled it out better. So there's no better way to sort of like collaboratively build data quality by always checking to see, do these patterns we see in the data match your lived experience? And if they do, then you can move on to, so are these patterns matching our expectations? If they don't match your lived experience, then you've got some work to do to help do some data quality issues and take care of some of those issues by having conversations, about what is this item or what is this domain, the items in this domain mean to this group compared to that group compared to that group. And then finally, when you slice by various groups, are you surprised by looking at how those groups are the same or different in terms of when you're looking at that initial everlast change? So for example, I did one, I should have included it here, I apologize, but I'll just describe it to you briefly about taking just kids that had adjustment to trauma. In general, in the particular population I was looking at, the adjustment to trauma kids had higher needs in general, but when you looked at the percent of reduction from ever to last, they were very similar. It was the same percentage reduction. So when you think about it programmatically, that's good news in terms of people are experiencing a similar type of need reduction. What was interesting though is when you just took those kids that had adjustment to trauma at initial, and then you compared those who had it resolved by their last assessment compared to those who did not, that's where you saw that adjustment to trauma was very predictive of a lot of other items going unresolved if it itself was not resolved. So those are just some ways that you can kind of use that simple visualization to compare populations and to do some program exploration around patterns that you all might be seeing. So Kate's going to walk through a couple other examples. I know we may want to think about taking a break. I did want to just quickly show for you, so I'm trying to get my screen to work properly here. Just to give you a preview. So we don't have it, like I said, operational right now. That's why it says private right here, but there will be a menu bar that says visualization garden. And then we will likely have sub-menus that are like the TCOM suite of reports or these smaller curated subsets of visualizations that you could quickly navigate to. But essentially, this is sort of what it would look like. So we just walked through this one. It would have those all those 6 areas that we talked about, how it's being used, the preparation of the data. We will want to include like even an example of the data table. I think that could be helpful for folks to know, here's how I'm going to have to kind of structure my data to produce this report. So we'll have all of those items and we'll have it as like a blog entry. But the blog entry, the plan is that we will also tag it with all these different things, tagging it with different aspects on the phases. We can tag it with things like individual, descriptive, or in this case, we would tag it both as a subgroup, whole group, or evaluative. The purpose behind that is if you're coming to peruse the garden and you're like, I'm really looking for something at a subgroup level, you would be able to use that tag to search just for those visualizations that are related to subgroups. Or if you're like, I really want an evaluative report that is a subgroup level, you'd be able to use both those tags to quickly curate for yourself the visualizations that people are using. So I just kind of wanted to provide that as a quick teaser for how we're planning on putting that on the TCOM Conversations blog site. So I'm going to look to my other moderator or my other colleagues here to see how we want to proceed.
Shall we ask folks for
Okay, I think
examples of this?
you're-
Oh, am I mute? I shouldn't be on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm able to hear you, Kate.
Okay, great. So maybe this is the point where we'll ask folks for examples that we can walk through, and as they're shuffling around looking for them, we can go through the example that I had prepared. But if folks want to, I think Stephen, you have, did we lose Stephen? Oh, he's there, right? Stephen, you have an email address from the PowerPoint slides you'd like to put up?
Oh, for the slides themselves?
For the-
In the slides. Yes.
I can just put it in the chat box.
Okay,
Okay.
great.
Yeah. So if you all have visualizations you want to share, you can send them to me. I'll put my email in the chat box, and then we can discuss.
Yeah, so if you have a favorite visualization that you're using that you'd like to share, and I hate to put you on the spot, but if you send it to us, we can walk through it or help you walk through it, but make it more of a conversation. In the meantime, I can go through another kind of more complex visualization, so that we can see how this works again through a second example. But if somebody has a good one coming in, then we can forego my example and work on yours. So Madelyn, should we go ahead and work through the other example, take a quick break while we wait for emails? How would you like to do this next piece?
I'd say maybe let's take a quick break if everyone's okay with that. We're halfway through the session, and that would give folks a chance to send anything that they want to share.
Okay, great.
Okay, so like 5 minutes, is that good? We'll come back 5 after?
Yeah, works for me.
Okay.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to say we're going to take a couple extra minutes. Stephen's computer decided to restart, so we'll be waiting for that, but he should be back momentarily.
Hey, Madeline, Michaela, I'm on by phone right now. My computer is restarting. It totally like completely just shut down. So Madeline, if you have the slides when we resume, if you can bring them up, that'd be great.
Absolutely, I'll pull those up.
Yeah, Madeline. So in the interest of time, we should probably, move forward here. I see there's some great examples that are coming in. So that's fabulous.
Absolutely. Yeah, I went ahead and shared with you and Stephen the ones that came in through email. I will let you decide which ones you want to highlight or not, and I'll go ahead and pull up the slides as well.
Yeah, I mean, shall we start with the ANZA client report from Brandon?
Sure.
You want to pull that one up?
I will do that. Hang on just a second.
And then are there questions while you're pulling that up? Are there questions that we didn't get to in the chat, Michaela?
Not that I'm seeing right now.
Okay, great. And then is Brandon on the line? And would you like to help walk us through?
It actually looks like Claire has a question from above. Claire, if you want to hop on audio to ask it, that's fine. Oh, and I see yours now.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, so when we are pulling our sample of cans to look at, we have a lot of clients in our system that may like go between different programs. So is the report that you use, is it program based or is it client based, so that you're looking at the comparing can scores over time, regardless of what program that cans came from?
So I usually have two ways to look at the aggregate data. So I call one a lifetime, because we do experience that a lot of folks will have, will come for care for a while, they may leave, and then they may come back for more care. And so you should be able to look over either the lifetime of the person or of everyone you've helped, or by program, because the program is really going to identify the particular interventions and care that was provided. And so that can be helpful to inform the system about the program. Who is that programming serving well? Where are the strengths in that program for serving folks? Are we really good at serving folks with who have anger? Or are we really good at serving folks who have trauma? And who are we not serving as well? Who could we improve or add more supports to our program for? So if we look at a program, those are the types of questions we're asking. If we're looking at a lifetime, then we're asking, who are we helping over a lifetime, no matter what program they're in? Do we have the right kinds of programs to help our population that's being either referred to us or that we're engaging or outreaching to? So it's a slightly different question, but I would say you look at both. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so if we're ready to move forward, I'll go ahead and pull up this visualization that Brandon sent us. And Brandon, I'm not going to put you on the spot. You don't have to tell us the entire process of how you created this thing, but if you have anything you want to share about it, feel free to.
It also looks like Brandon might be having some connectivity issues.
Okay.
So he might be corresponding via chat.
Okay.
Well, we can walk through this. This is really nice. I mean, this looks really pretty. In terms of it appears that we're looking at total actionable items. So again, for folks before, that would be all the 2s and 3s. Now, I'm not sure if it appears, if I look at the table below, it's including both needs and strengths. And I'm not sure if it's including underlying items either. So that would be one question to ask is, are we including underlying items? Are we looking at only things that are modifiable? So we really want to make sure we're including only modifiable things when we're looking to modify.
I would interject real quick. Brandon said to me, the total actionable items chart up top is all actionable items, but he will be taking a look at the items he's including to make sure they're not underlying. So. Yep,
perfect. And so then it looks like this is for one particular youth. So this is an individual. And it is, so it's not a group, it's an individual. And we're looking that over time, the individual had 29 actionable items, then 23, then 9. So we're seeing a significant improvement. We've addressed 20 needs and or strengths built. And so if we look below, we can see which one those are in the red, yellow, green. Work readiness, it seems, was resolved. It went from a score. Now this is 67%, so that looks aggregate, whereas at the top we had one child. I wonder what the percentage means in the percent actual per domain. So can you scroll up just 1 minute? Thank you. It's age 15. So this is where I probably need Brandon's help, because it looks like it's one youth at the top, but then there's a percentage per domain. Percentage actionable. Oh, work readiness is a whole domain. And so there are 67% items that are actionable in that domain for that one child, is I guess how I would interpret it.
He says yes in the chat.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yes. I was thinking work readiness was a single item. So it's a whole domain. Okay, so then we have 67% of the items in the, so this is a domain level table at the bottom where we're seeing a huge increase in improvement in work readiness and work performance, work orientation, and work experience. Now, where we're having some needs arise is in behavior and emotional. And those colors are really nice to see where the changes are occurring. And if we look at strengths, it looks like that's where the ever comes in, right? So in the beginning of care, we were really focusing on work readiness and work type domains. And we didn't identify a lot of strengths to build at first. We only identified 38% of the strengths possible. But then perhaps at the second assessment, we had shifted our focus because we had started to address those needs, now we've shifted our focus into, okay, what strengths can we build? And then we identified actionable strengths. So in this case, especially, this one in particular, to me, shows that this is kind of a shifting on focus, not somebody's getting worse. So if we're just adding up all actionable items and we're saying more actionable items in that second one because there's more strengths to build, well, we don't want to interpret that as people getting worse. And worse yet, we don't want to discourage our care providers from finding strengths midway through that could be built or could be a focus of care because they're worried that that's going to count against them in their initial to last. If we don't look at ever, and we're just looking at initial to last, the unintended consequences is that we are discouraging folks from either finding and discovering, internalizing, or issues that maybe need to be revealed to us through a trusting relationship. And we are discouraging the identification of strengths to build. And that is never something we want to do in care. That's why the ever becomes so important. That's like, where are the areas that we were ever working on throughout care? And then what are the areas that we're working on now? And that's what gives you that true change over time. So when you look at these 23 items from the second assessment, they are not 23 of the 29. In fact, you've probably addressed 15 items between 29 and 23, but it only looks like you addressed 7 because the differences in that change. You might have 8 new ones and you've addressed 15. And so the net delta looks like 7, but the hidden part in there is if you're not looking at ever, you're missing the other 8 items you addressed. You're not accounting for it. And the worst thing that can happen is you address 7 needs, right? You're doing really great. And then you identify 7 strengths to build and your net looks like 0. It looks like no change. So if you're just looking at actionable items and you're just looking at, okay, how many are there on this assessment versus last assessment, your net could look like 0 when really there's great progress being made. So that's the one thing that if you don't want to look at just have the chart above, but this contextualizing of the table below really is super helpful to show that there were a lot more than, did I say 6, 29 to 23, my math is off. There are a lot more than 6 items that were addressed. There were many more. So that's the key there. And I know it's kind of a hard concept because you like 29 to 23, 6 things were addressed. No, it was more like 15. But we can't see that from this particular graph.
There's a little bit more below that's also interesting.
This is the item level, yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is great. You have the total actionable needs, the domain level, and now here at the item level, you can see that some family interpersonal issues came up in the middle of care, and that's not unusual, especially if folks are addressing trauma in their life or trauma or setting boundaries with family members that maybe they hadn't set before. So that's, and again, in this case, this may be a sign of a transformation that is moving in the right trajectory. So, I know Stephen said earlier, anger is going to come up a lot for folks who are working through relationships and, interpersonal needs where they're needing to kind of get angry about what happened to them. Instead of being depressed and suicidal about what happened to them, a good trajectory often includes shifting that over to anger and then eventually figuring out how to kind of deal with that anger and then set those appropriate boundaries, right? So something along those lines may be a good trajectory, and it may not always be a downward slope. We're going to see things appear and be discovered before everything kind of settles back in place. And we don't want to discourage that trajectory by just going across and counting items and setting kind of blunt goals on reducing items. If we now look at ever, once again, now we're going to say these things were always there, or if they weren't there, they were just under the surface, right? They were always there. It's not like there is possibility that care did create a problem, but more likely than not, care is helping you move through those problems, and it's going to look different for everyone. And I know Stephen and I have been talking about how do we really begin to map those trajectories of success, where you're looking at, here's a group of people with similar circumstances that reach success. What did their journey look like? Where was those peaks and valleys in that journey? And so what can we say? This is, you're on the right path. This is what your experience here, most people experience through this journey that have similar circumstances to you.
I think from
So I don't
a,
know. Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, I didn't know if Brandon had audio, but go, you jump in, Stephen.
so so it sounds like too, he's saying when they're using this report, when you click on a domain level, it'll filter these items down below to that domain, which is really nice.
Nice.
But from a practical standpoint too, like when we're thinking about the visualization garden, this is what you're looking at here would be kind of like a dashboard, like a single person dashboard almost, where you really have three visualizations that you're looking at here. There's the one at the very top, which is the line that's similar to like the average impact in the sense that it's showing that roll up level of need that's reducing over time. You have that second visualization, which is showing percentages across each domain, and then you have this third visualization here, which is at the item level. So we would likely, from a visualization garden standpoint, we would want to have each of these kind of entered separately, but then have a place where we can say, in this use case for Treehouse, it looks like they're combining these three to make sort of like a dashboard. And it's a great segue into letting you all know our preferred path for how a visualization makes it to the visualization garden. It doesn't mean it has to happen this way every time. But Brandon, we'll be reaching out to you, and if you're up for it, if you're game for it, our preferred path is to actually take this entire dashboard that you're looking at and actually have you do a blog post on TCOM Conversations saying, here's how we're using this. This is the value we're getting out of it. If you can actually tell it from the story of the people that are using it, or even collaborate with them to write the blog post with you, that would be awesome. So we would have the blog post that really gives the context and the flavor of how this is being used. And then from the blog post, we would say, if you would like to create this visualization in your reporting platform, then you can go to each one of these in the visualization garden and get all the details that you need to be able to produce this on your reporting platform. So I just thought it'd be a great way to plug how we are planning to approach getting items into the visualization garden.
This might be a good time, Madelyn, to bring up the form, and we can walk through the form with this visualization.
I was thinking that, and I have it right here. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Yeah, but I think somebody was trying to jump in. So just
sorry. I was just going to ask in terms of, do you also want things like SQL code and that's the stuff that's behind all the dashboards?
Yeah, I would say what you're using to produce it, the way you would communicate, however we need to communicate it so that somebody using potentially a different reporting platform would still be able to produce the same visualization. So yeah, if there's some kind of aspect that you're using that's important to it, I would say, yeah, we would need to include that. If it's a SQL, if it's specific to SQL, I would say just if we could capture the essence of the query. If somebody's using SQL, they're more than happy to copy and paste the code. But if they're using something else, we could capture the essence of what the query is trying to do.
Right. Thank you.
All right, so I have this pulled up here. I've gone ahead and added, since we last looked at it, some questions about which tool and version you're using as well, because that came up. So you'll see this very directly follows our 6 steps on the slide about from seed to sprout, how you get to your visualization. So it pretty directly follows that. You'll see, what questions does the visualization seek to answer? I added some information about what tool it uses and which version of that, just so we have that information. We ask about context of use, audience, and for this you can select more than one, or you can enter another option. For example, if it's several, you can select all that are involved.
So I think for Brandon's, this would be for a clinician and practitioner, maybe a supervisor as well to provide supervision. So I just wanted to be more, specific about that. And I think in the last one, you can scroll up a little bit. The context would be in care.
Mhm. Yeah, it's helpful to give that example of it.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Kate.
And it's the ANZA. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so yeah, so keep going. Yeah.
So then we look at phase, and these are the same examples from before.
So appropriateness and effectiveness were probably the two for this one.
Okay.
And it could even be used as a conversation about, are we ready to transition?
Yeah.
So it really could cover any of, yeah, all three
Oh
of those.
yeah. Or engaged is the person, are we engaging the person appropriately in care? They're making progress.
Sure. And I think often one could fit into multiple phases, perhaps.
Yep.
And then for utility and units, we have the same matrix that we saw earlier and that Stephen previewed on the blog. You can select, again, as many of these as it applies to you.
And in
So
this
this would-
instance,
Yep.
it's,
Go ahead,
yeah,
Stephen.
it's at the individual level and it's evaluative. So we're looking at that change over time.
Mm-hmm. And then we ask about measure type. So we spoke before about, you know, how a process measures steps within a process and the product measures the outcome. So you can choose whichever it is.
I would think of this as a product, wouldn't you, Kate?
Yes,
really
this would be,
looking at the
this would be a
change.
product. Yeah, we're looking at change over time. What are the results? A process would be more of, were the assessments done on time for this person, or were they missed?
Right. So we ask about how data is prepared. We ask
That might need a bigger box, but it looks expandable.
exactly. You can take up.
Yeah, this is Brandon. I was about to say that would definitely need a bigger box.
Okay. Thanks, Brandon.
But I'll make sure you can put as much as you need to in that section. We ask for an example and its interpretations, and then if possible for someone to upload an example.
So then Brandon, if you would upload that file here, and then in the example interpretations, just give some textual description of it like you were doing in the chat. But is there anything, Brandon, I want to give you the floor here if there's anything else you'd like to say as well.
Yeah, actually, I saw Allison's question about the colorization in the threes, and especially when it comes to strengths coming up in red and it really becoming like a lead balloon. We were having the same issue. What I shared here was an initial concept, and we've since made some changes, especially around strengths. I will be looking back into the total actionable items up top. That was a great point earlier. Yeah, and also just training our managers on like not using it punitively or how to interpret it. We had to do a lot of back and forth. So that report and the use of the ANSA T RISE employee with one of our programs is being piloted right now, and it isn't being used across the entire program, just to kind of figure out these issues that arise and how it's interpreted, how they're going to use it in their one-on-ones, whether they
Mommy wants to go shower. Then come upstairs in mommy's bed. Get your blue game and come on mommy's bed.
Somebody's not on mute.
It's not me. So yeah, we're asking all those questions right now, whether they are using it
Hi, good morning.
or in their one-on-ones. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, so I think so ultimately the link to this will be on the landing page for the visualization garden on the TCOM Conversations blog. But if we have everyone's email addresses in this group, we can send out the link for some early seeds that you all may have. You don't have to feel obligated to enter something, but if you do have some ideas, we'll make sure folks get the link, and then we'll make this live. And I don't know if any of you, I thought I had the book right next to me here, and apparently I don't, but there's a great book called The Lean Startup by, I believe his last name is R-E-I-S, I think Eric Ries is I believe how you say it. If you don't want to read the book, you can just Google his like Google Talk and you'll get the gist of the book. But the idea in the book is this notion of a lean startup is that you don't want to build something, spend a lot of time building and developing something only to find out nobody wants it. And so he highlights his story of doing a startup, tech startup, where they spent a ton of time building something that turned out nobody wanted. And so he has this concept of minimum viable product. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here is we want to, even ultimately this may evolve to something beyond the TCOM Conversations blog. We had conversations about whether or not the search features were doing what we needed. But ultimately what we decided is it's a place we can start. We can build the wireframe for what we're trying to do. And then we can engage you all in the community to start asking questions. Several of you have asked questions today, and I made notes like, oh man, we're going to need to put that consideration in here and put this consideration there. So this is definitely going to be a work in progress, and we're going to need all of your help in really making it into something, into a beautiful garden, if you will, right? So so anyway, I wanted to throw that out there that is the approach we're taking. So if it feels like it's not fully put together, that's intentional in the sense that we didn't want to spend a lot of time developing something only to later have to go back and make a whole bunch of course corrections. So we'll adapt as we move forward and move together. And it's actually a good point too that we can address Allison's, I know, or why don't you finish this out, Madelyn, and then Allison had another question that I want to address.
Sure. So the only two remaining questions we ask about format considerations and then actions that could be taken after viewing the data this way. And then we submit it and it comes to us and then we move forward.
So Brandon, thanks for volunteering. Your homework is to be the first submission. That's your reward. Your reward for volunteering is that you get to submit.
All right, and we had just a couple other cool visualizations that were emailed. So if we have a chance and want to circle back to that, let me know and I'll share.
Yeah, I would love to see at least one more, if not two more. But so real quickly, it looked like Allison had a question about missing strengths and identifying those as threes. And it says this works for most all things except for spirituality, religion. Vermont is a highly agnostic state, and having a 3 on that item show up in red, which it currently does, goes over like a lead balloon. So we've struggled to marry the philosophy of the strengths with the reporting.
So if I could just add, Allison, we did a stakeholder informed process with California Department of Social Services where the same issue came up. We had about 200 stakeholders engage over about 8-week process where we developed reports for sharing with families. And the strengths report, what we ended up deciding, and I can send you a mock-up of it, was that when it's a 3, there's nothing on the report. It's just blank. We leave it blank. And some folks had a little bit of, some folks were uncomfortable with a blank space on the report, but it was better than saying 3 or red. Or so we used, instead of colors, because they were family reports, we used icons, and they were sunflowers from seed to a full sunflower. And so normally a 3 on a need would be a watering can. You got to water the seed because the seed kind of looked like a turd. So we didn't use a turd as seed, we used a watering can. When he printed out, it just didn't look right. So we used a watering can. So but on the strengths, we didn't put any watering cans for 3s. It was either blank or it was something to build, or it was a watering can for that. So I think that's common when it comes to strengths. A 3 can either be that it's not something we're focused on, or it can be something we need to build. And then the other way to address that in electronic systems is to set thresholds on those areas so that you identify for this particular item, a 3 is not always something for focus, but you allow folks to toggle that on as a focus. So you have to create a second flag that's not only the score, but also a flag for if it's a focus. So it's a 3 and a focus, or it's a 3 and it's not a focus of care.
Thanks, Kate. I would just add, I like your second option better, only because one of the first reports we were ever able to generate was what are the top issues for children and families coming in. And it was really invaluable to see that it wasn't oppositionality, anger, and depression. It was resiliency, community connection, those not being present. And we got a lot of traction with the cans by highlighting that. So people are really interested in that chart, and it does list them together. And it puts a higher bar for resiliency not being in place as a 3. And so I wouldn't want to get rid of that if all possible, because it's just been so beneficial to our work of building strengths.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
like that's a cool idea. Thank you.
Add a toggle. Yep, that's what we did.
So
Yeah, so that's both a data consideration and a formatting consideration, right? So it's the data consideration is, do you need to add that toggle, and then the formatting consideration is then how ultimately does that display on the report. So these are all great great options where I'm hopefully now, as we've spent some time together, you can see why our approach of moving away from sort of standardization to this notion of customization and really helping everyone articulate how it is we're presenting information. We can use a lot of the same charts and graphics, but we just need to be able to articulate what's included in it.
So something I just wanted to ask your perspectives on. I know that Magellan is not the only one that has taken strengths and reversed it on our reports to report the 0s and 1s as strengths. Do you have perspective that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've done the same thing again in California for CDSS. We also proposed a format where they looked at strengths to build in one graph and then strengths present in another graph. And so you can see strengths present increasing, and then you can see strengths to build decreasing. I think having them both is informative. That would be my suggestion. Yeah, so I think that's great. I think it's good to look at when strengths are present, and you can also see when strengths are present, especially like resilience, that the change in needs is often greater.
This is where notes are very helpful, because I know at the last TCOM conference, we had 2 groups that were sitting and looking at strengths in particular. So it was the percent of strengths. And they were like, wow, our programs are so different. But one was the percent of strengths that were built over time. So as strengths were developed, that was going up. And the other one was showing strengths to build. It was the percent of strengths to build. So it was going down. And in that context, they were saying that the social workers had provided feedback saying that when we look at needs, we're always trying to bring the bar down. And they wanted to have consistency in that. They said we didn't want to have one bar going down and one bar going up. So they wanted to see strengths in the same way. But without those notes, they were looking at what they thought was the same visualization, but it turns out it's representing different things.
Yeah, so having all 3 is good too.
So Madelyn, should we try to run through at least one more?
Absolutely. So I'll pull up this next one submitted by Barbara Dunn.
Oh. Yeah, so, and just so you know, I couldn't send a systems view because it's all live system. I don't have a demo system. But something that we've been struggling with is race and ethnicity. And so someone had just sent sort of a bunch of CANS data and said, well, what can we do with this to see, are we meeting the needs of kids who are different race and ethnicities? Unfortunately, as you could see from the count, we had a small number. So the only disaggregation I could do was youth who said they were white, and youth who non-white is, it could be white and another, so biracial, biethnic, but everybody else ended up in this group. So right there, it's a little bit problematic, but just trying to understand how we can look at the youth coming in, how are they different? And then, of course, you could see here, so we've got the domains, and the strengths here are 0s and 1s. So those go up over time, So we've got a pre and post for white and non-white youth. And then we have the different domain, the needs domains, which of course we want to see them go down, and the total needs are just the needs and how they go down. And then we started just looking into some other things that obviously we saw that gender was different in race and ethnicity. So just trying to understand, how we can do that kind of descriptive look. So this is more descriptive to figure out youth coming in, so there's an access question, and then actual change over time. Are we able to impact non-white youth and white youth similarly, or are they different? So I sent this in mostly to get feedback more than anything else.
Hey, Madelyn, would you mind also bringing up the backup of the slides? The example that I was going to go through was similar to this, but only answering one of those questions, which was the access question,
Okay.
not change. And it might, sometimes I think we might try to do too much in one visualization.
Right.
And so separating out, okay, who are we serving and what are their needs from, did we address those needs? Madelyn, do you have those slides?
I do. I'll pull them up. Hang on just a second.
This may be helpful. And you can have the slides, of course, after Barbara. This may or may not be helpful.
And honestly, it's always a struggle how much information to put in one, because if you only put part of the information, they're going to ask the next question.
Right.
So
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So this one here is, of course, inspired by our Italian friends. I'm not sure if they're on the call today, but it has both so who was enrolled in care there in that example. So here, go one more. Yep. So here we have who was enrolled. One more.
Sorry.
Yeah. So here we have who is enrolled in care by gender. And so you have all the different, and this is strengths to build. So I did put their strengths to build instead of strengths present. So we do have all the domains there for male and female, and you can kind of see if you group together the domains, you can see a pattern for male that's different than female in the way that we've grouped in the bar graph. And then below in the radial chart, the spider web chart, depending on what you want to call it, you can really see that for boys, life functioning and behavioral health, behavior and emotional health are kind of high needs, whereas for girls, it's more strengths to build and trauma. And so one more slide by race. There you go. So then in this slide, we're looking at it by race. And so again, you can see the pattern kind of change if we group together by race at the top. So you can see kind of a pattern of where the spikes are. So like Native American, you see a spike in the first column versus Latino, you see a spike in the second column, right? So there's like this little different of this pattern in the way that we've grouped it. So of course, Latino, you've got behavior and emotional health. With Native American, it's life functioning. And then below is that same information, but on that radial chart. And so you can see if gray, you can see Latino has the highest need in behavior and emotional. But if we look at Asian Pacific Island youth, you see strengths to build, trauma, and behavior and emotional, and slightly functioning are kind of where their needs of focus are. So, or areas of focus are. So this is kind of another way, but this is only answering the question of access. We don't look at change at all. This is like this would either be the first or the initial assessment or the ever assessment, looking at what their needs were ever that we were identifying. So I don't know if that helps, but it's part of what you were asking about in one option.
Yeah, I think, in terms of access to separating them out.
Separating them out, yeah.
And I know that for some folks, they have a really hard time, reading that spider web. So are there any other visuals that you've come across that might have a similar visualization, but not the spider web?
I think the top, this provides the same information in two ways. Like, do you ever watch those cooking shows? We made potatoes in 3 ways. It may not be so bad to like put it 3 ways, the same exact information, because some people want to see the bars. I like the spider web. I think that, to me, I can really see where the needs are differing. You'd never want to put more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on a spider web. Already we're getting to, already getting, there's too many flies stuck in this web. And so, but if you could add another way to that, I don't know, let's just throw that out to the group. What are other ways you visualize this type of information across gender or race? So somebody said you could group the top domains rather than by race or ethnicity. You could also group the top domains rather than by race, ethnicity.
Yep.
Stephen, I'm not following that exactly. Could you expand on that?
It looks like you could organize it by the bars would represent the, the domains, and then the colors would be.
Oh.
Yep.
Oh, so
Just
the-
basically, yeah, that's how I interpreted that.
Right. So yeah, so you could put all life functioning together across races as the first group, all behavior and emotional together across race. Yeah, so that would be, so a third one. I prefer this way personally, but other folks may prefer the one where you're grouping. And so adding a third one. So I don't think it's a bad idea personally to have multiple options, because people are going to just gravitate toward a different one.
Right.
And I do think it's helpful to be able to present to your organization, especially, so this is where it gets really, really helpful to hone in on the question you're trying to answer, because then you can say which of these presentations helps to answer that question, or help us make the decision we're trying to make given the data that we have. Because I could definitely see a place where, so if you look at the first bar in each of those going across the top, imagine just all of those together. So now you're looking at life functioning, and you're seeing within life functioning the differences across race. So I could definitely see it that way as well. I could see it in both. So it would really just depend on how you're planning on using the information. And the race ethnicity stuff is an interesting one in and of itself, right? Because you've got it's very helpful. I just think this is a good opportunity to always, plug that reminder. We should be using data as a conversation starter, right? So we need to always, seeing the pattern is one thing, acknowledging or asking folks whether the pattern matches their lived experience is another very important question that I highlighted earlier. And then really asking ourselves that question: what does this mean? So what does that mean to us? Is this good news, bad news? Is it no news? What does it mean? And very often we may find ourselves having to ask additional questions to unpack the meaning behind it. And I think that's something that we often overlook. There's the myth that if you get the report, all your questions are answered, and that's just simply not true.
Yeah.
Can I jump in and make a quick point on this?
Yep.
So I love this example. So this is really well done. I would want to highlight, just to play off what you just said, Stephen, that this is such a great example of how we have to be careful to make sure we are always framing the sample frame when we talk about the findings. Because you could look at this, and somebody who might be naive to the analysis might say, well, this means that people of color have more needs than white people, white kids in this case, maybe. But actually the interpretation might more likely be that access to care is different across these groups. And the threshold of getting into care is lower for white people than it is for people of color. So I think that keeping it as a conversation and always being very, very clear about what the sample frame is fundamental to having a good conversation rather than a conversation that actually is potentially misleading.
Yeah.
I'm bouncing between this presentation and the racial justice presentation, so I'm kind of sensitized to these complexities.
Yes, that's great. And also, gosh, I just lost my point, but there were 2 points I wanted to make. One was considering race, age, and gender together is super important, because you're going to get these will show differently if white tended to be more likely female and more likely older versus Latino that were more likely male and more likely younger. So looking at really drilling into it by race and by age. And then to follow up on John's point that, yeah, it's so important that we are success focused, that we're not looking at, who are the problems, but who are the people that we can help and how can we help them? If these are the people that we're serving, what supports can we put into place to help those with more needs, not looking at them as larger challenges, but greater opportunities.
Right. And that was my struggle in that one, because the main question that we were being asked are we serving not just access, but are we serving individuals of other races and ethnicities as well as the main population?
Very good. There is another, just real quickly, it's in the chat. I saw it said, this is from Kristen. or Kirsten saying, as stated earlier, it is really important to consider the audience. Sometimes you have the luxury of walking through a visualization with the audience and you have some aha moments. With the spiderweb chart, it seems that people aren't used to seeing data that way, but once they understand how to look at it, many may really like it. And that's been my experience as well, that sometimes charts can look overwhelming, but once you understand what they're showing you, that can make all the difference. And so I just think that's another great, excellent point to keep in mind. I know we're coming up on time. So one thing that I definitely wanted to, Kate, I didn't know, did you want to show any more? Are you good?
No, that's good. I wasn't even going to show this, but Barbara's example inspired, you know, some comparison of different ways to look at things, and just a conversation about making sure we're not trying to answer too many questions with one, because we may not answer any question well. You know, it might be better to have more visualizations that are more specifically focused. But I know Barbara's was very exploratory, and so you weren't even getting to that point where you were answering the question, Barbara. So I do realize that. Yep.
So part of what I would love to hear from you all, is now that you've had the opportunity to kind of see what it is we're trying to do with the visualization garden, you know, we need to definitely, there's the structure that's simply putting it on, you know, online, making it available. I think we've got a lot of that infrastructure in place. There's been a lot of richness in this discussion. And so what are some ideas that you all have in terms of how we might look at moving this forward? What are some things, and you know, now that you've had a chance to kind of get a sense of what we're trying to do, what are ideas that you all have that would be helpful in really bringing some life to this garden, if you will?
I can't wait to see everybody's ideas. I know folks are going to jump on that form. Hey, where can they access that form?
We will.
We haven't published it yet, but we can publish it and send it out, like Stephen said, in an email to attendees, and then ultimately it will live on the blog.
Do folks feel like, says, are there specific software programs that are more compatible to uploading to the blog? So the way that it'll make its way to the blog is through, the very first thing would either just be an email to me or to Madelyn, or like we said, we'll have that form, the submission form, live on the blog. So that's kind of where things would start. And so we'll be monitoring that, and then we'll engage with you. There may be some where it's more kind of an idea or a question that you have that you're looking for some partnership to formulate the idea with. There may be some where, like we saw Brandon, where it's a chart that you all are using regularly, in which case we would go through that process of probably wanting to create a blog post about it and then have the visualizations on the garden. So I think those would be some of the pathways to getting it there. I'm wondering, though, after having this conversation, whether or not it would be helpful to have some kind of regularly occurring meeting where we're talking about current submissions, ideas, things that people have, so that we can continue to benefit from this sort of, larger discussion, whether that be like a quarterly kind of get together where we have a virtual gathering and go through some of the things that we've seen submitted, or go through ideas that people may have. What are folks' thoughts on that? Seeing things coming through the chat, yeses. Some people even up for more frequent meetings. We've talked about this concept for developing methodologies, like more, advanced analytics pieces. We hadn't really talked about it for the visualization garden, but after today's conversation, I am definitely seeing a need for this. Somebody also said maybe also making a sort of best practices type of info sheet yeah, like Kate and someone else said, talking about showing strengths to build, and some, oh, probably, yeah, the notions about best practices of how we might represent particular things. Brandon saying, I'd like some way to meet or ask questions and work through problems together. Yeah, so it looks like lots of folks are very interested interested in those pieces. So we will definitely figure out a way to sort of sponsor that and be the host and hub for having regular conversation. I don't see why we couldn't, put out ahead of time to say, here's what we're going to be talking about in this one. So we'll look at submissions and different things that are coming in. We'll do our best to kind of figure out a way that we can look at where there's a lot of interest, and then we'll, kind of be able to send out to the community, here's what we're going to be talking about. So if you want to join, if this is interesting to you, come join us. That way people can self-select in or out of the group. We may need, though, as we've learned with groups, we may need to solicit some volunteers who are willing to be a core members, so that we always have some momentum to keep the group alive and going. And then we'll work out a way to help forecast to folks what it is what items we're going to be looking at. Yeah, lots of good things coming in. Allison, cleaning data tips would be helpful. When to drop cans from the data set, how to handle change in a time frame when someone has 3 cans and some have 2, how to set the parameters. These are all really good. All right. So yeah, we will definitely start pulling that together. We will, again, we're always looking at doing things in a collaborative way. So if any of you have interest in helping us lead this work, please email me or Madelyn, and we'll kind of take names there, and we'll begin to do that. We'll create a group. I think this would be really great, and then we'll be able to kind of build the garden together. And we're super excited and really thankful that you all were here. We appreciated the conversation. Any final thoughts, Kate or Madelyn?
No, I'm excited that people are excited, though. And I think this is going to go in a really cool and interesting direction.
Yeah, I just think that there's, like I said in the beginning, I fully drink all of the Kool-Aid, all of the flavors of the Kool-Aid. I think there's so much that we can do with these tools that we're just beginning to scratch the surface. So I think that a group like this would be fabulous to really dig in and see all the ways that we can identify institutionalized bias and filter it out, and create more of a person-centered care approach, and really focus on strengths. And so I'm excited that people are engaged to do that. That's it. Thank you.
All right. Michaela, are there any housekeeping things we need before we let people go?
Yeah, thanks to Stephen, Madelyn, and Kate for a wonderful master presentation.